All right. So my name is Nele Feldman. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I see a lot of familiar faces. I see some new faces, which is a great mix. I'd like to welcome everyone to our final virtual session for this year. It's not the final session in this series, but it will be the last time that we're meeting in 2021. And we really appreciate everyone's continued interest in our virtual series in this topic. And we hope that again, today's session will, inspire new ideas and encourage new perspectives, but also most likely there will be maybe even more questions when you leave than you have right now. Today's session will explore how initiatives and campuses can set students up for success before they're or after they're accepted to their programs. And that will include questions around pre-arrival and pre-study preparation. And then in our second panel, we will focus on creating inclusive campus environments so that all students can thrive both academically and personally. We are excited to again have a really fantastic group of moderators and panelists that will share their experiences and their perspectives with us today. You should have received the agenda in an email that I sent out last Friday, but for those who may just be joining us today, I have also copied the agenda in the chat to your right. We usually, and this time again, we include all the speaker bios in the agenda, so you can, go back to the agenda, take a look at the speaker bios if you would like to have a more complete picture on our speakers, but it saves us some time so we don't go into those extensive introductions before the panels. Today's session will again be structured around panel discussions. We have two panel discussions that will focus on, number one, good practices in preparing students for a new academic but also cultural environment. That will be the first panel, followed by a discussion on supporting student inclusion on campus and beyond. We will have time for Q&A after each panel discussion. So I really encourage you, typically it's a little difficult to have everyone unmute themselves if you're a bigger group, but I really encourage you to please use the chat box to put down your questions for our panelists today, and then I will read out the questions to the panel. So we will have some time after each panel discussion today. So with that, I don't want to take any more time. I'm really pleased to welcome my colleague, Rebecca Granado. She is the Associate Vice President of Global Initiatives for Bard College, but she's also one of the co-chairs of the Global Task Force on Third Country Education Pathways. And Rebecca will be guiding us through our first panel discussion today. So Rebecca, with that, over to you.
Thank you, Nele. And it's great to see so many people here, some of whom we've seen in past webinars. So welcome, everybody. We have a great group of speakers today, and I believe that everyone got a chance to read the bios. So I will just introduce people by their names and their titles. And as Nele said, what we're going to be focusing on for the next 30 minutes is looking at the preparation that different programs provide for students, as well as some of the questions that come up in relation to preparing students and orienting them to campus life in advance of them
was
arriving.
expecting your call a little bit earlier. And actually, at the moment, I'm following a webinar. So if possible, I would like to ask you to call me back, or I call you in about
we'll wait for Nele to mute our participants.
By 4:30.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nele. So we have 3 speakers today, and we'll go through a series of questions and generate some discussion. And then hopefully we'll have a number of questions from the audience as well. So joining us for this portion of the presentation is Priscilla Gomez, the education specialist from UNHCR. We have Elvaro Zuniga, coordinator of complementary pathways at the Habesha Project, and Christina Milks, the manager of durable solutions for refugees from WUSC. So welcome to our 3 panelists. And I think we'll open the conversation and the discussion by just thinking a little bit about the importance of providing pre-arrival or pre-program orientations to students. And maybe a couple of you can comment on the types of services students typically need before enrolling in a degree program or starting their degree in a third country. And I think it'd be great if Alvaro could start us off.
Sure. Thank you, Rebecca. Well, from the perspective of Habesha project and preparing the students for before the higher education studies and our program, well, what we do is that the students, it's not a requirement to have a language proficiency or Spanish or English to apply for the program. So what the program has is a integration phase prior to arrival, prior to higher education studies, and in which students are offered intensive Spanish course, an intensive Spanish course, and also an academic orientation program, because we have identified that, first of all, it's very complex for the students to know Spanish, and all our programs are in Spanish. And in the past, like, we use the English as a bridge language learning Spanish, but we understand that also it shouldn't be a requirement because it's also complex for refugee students to have a big proficiency in a language. So we decided to eliminate that requirement and us to offer that service in terms of learning Spanish to, after that, being able to go to higher education. So that's one of the I think one of the main key points of one of the main services the organization offers to the students, and that opens more possibilities for more students to apply, as we understand that the language barrier is sometimes a key factor that makes the students unable to apply to programs. So after offering this language program, well, this year of integration phase that includes the language program, we will have also identified in some of our cases that students are not pretty sure about what they study, or probably through the time they want to change, or their thoughts change of what one they study, their major, their undergrad, or their master degrees. So we are also offering vocational orientation through these years, so the students can be completely sure if they want to study, and they don't start their higher education studies, and after a year, after a couple of months, they decide they didn't like the major they chose and they want to change, because that creates a problem, particularly for us, because we basically lose scholarship, and we stand in a bad position with the higher education institutions, and we have to get another scholarship. So it's problematic from our side. But from key components, these two key components, the language and the vocational orientation, there are two services that we offer in this first year of integration while we prepare the students to be ready to have access to higher education institutions in Mexico. And lastly, just to mention, in terms of cultural integration, this year, which offers the language and the academic orientation, it's also for the students to get to know what is living in Mexico, and what is going to be to go to a higher education institution in Mexico, because we understand also that it can be complex, that coming from another first country or origin country and just immediately going to the higher education institution without getting to know actually how the society works, how the language works, how the people works. So it's also part of this program and part of the services the Habesha project offers prior to entering to higher education institutions. Thank you.
I have a follow-up question, Alvaro, before we turn it over to another panelist. Actually, two. Maybe you can say, I'll start with this one. Maybe you can say a little bit more about what that vocational orientation looks like. Is it done as a kind of one-on-one orientation, or do you do it in groups?
Sure. It's one-on-one. No, it has to be one-on-one. What is in group is the Spanish classes. The Spanish classes, it's on groups, but the orientation vocation, it's one-on-one. We have what we call in Spanish, Plan Arranque Universitario, which in English will be university plan. basically. And in this university plan, with the student support coordinator of the team, they follow up individually with each of the students to really understand what they want to study. Also, in this integration phase, what we usually do, or we receive support from, is that through the higher education institutions partners we have, we identify students from careers that our students are interested in studying, so they can come to, not necessarily physically in Aguascalientes where the program is, or online, to explain to the students what is to study some specific careers. No? So as an example, a student can say, I'm interested in studying 3 undergraduate programs, no? Medicine, biotechnologies, and biomedicine, no? 3 careers that you could say that have some similarities, no? They're not the same career, but you could say that they could have some subjects, correlated subjects, no? So what we try to do with the higher education institutions, mostly with the students, it's to offer like samples of how the classes work in those majors, so the students can get an idea of what will be studying that, no? But yeah, going back to the original question, it's a one-on-one orientation.
Great, thank you, Alvaro. I actually will ask my second question after we hear from Christine. Christine, maybe you can tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, from WUSC's perspective, what kinds of services students typically need before enrolling in a degree program in Canada.
Sure, thanks, Rebecca, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm really happy to be with you all today, able to share and to learn from others in the room. So I think that absolutely pre-arrival services are a really fundamental part of the suite of support we can provide to students. And I think in order to answer the question about like what types of pre-arrival support, there's a couple of factors that I wanted to throw out first. I think what we have learned over the years is that the content, the type of service, depends on a few other things. And so the things that I came up with, the sort of summary areas, is time. So sometimes we have 18 months to interact with students before they come to Canada. Sometimes we have 3 months. And the nature of that time is also different depending on what the immigration processes look like. So that time for students might be, 12 months after they've already obtained their visa and there's a certainty surrounding their departure to Canada, or that visa decision may come quite late in the pre-arrival phase. And the reason I highlight this is I think we've learned there's something really important to better understand about the state of mind of students when we are delivering pre-arrival, different types of pre-arrival supports. Sometimes it's kind of absorptive capacity, like close to departure, students' minds are in a lot of different places. And then I think there is also a reality that if we are intervening quite early in a student's process with pre-arrival services, prior to the rare circumstances when a student may not be approved to actually receive their visa, we have to also think about expectation management. So I think timing is a really key factor when we think about the content. But I think the content areas that are most important, what we've heard from academic institutions and what we've heard from students, similar to what Alvaro has said, obviously language. So, the students we're selecting in the student refugee program come to Canada and either study in English or French. For everyone, that is a second, third, fourth, fifth language. So although we require a certain amount of language proficiency to select a student, we do endeavor to invest in sort of upgrading, especially around academic language. We try to put a focus on some of the key skills they may need in a classroom context. Another one that's really risen to the forefront in the last 2 years, as you can imagine, with classrooms in Canada moving online, are digital literacy and online learning skills. So there's a real variety across the different countries of asylum where we're identifying students and how much exposure they would have had even to computers and basic sort of computer 101 skills, let alone the online environment and how you use the internet as a as a learning tool. So that's a whole area that we have done we've taken some baby steps, but we'd like to do more in. The third area, and maybe I know we'll talk maybe a little bit about this later. It's not a hard academic skill. We consider it sort of our soft skill area, which is looking at what we call leadership and life skills. So we're aware that, you know, students are about to make a really massive life change. And yes, it's an academic experience, but it's also resettlement, and it's also a cultural transition and other more complex sort of transitions that students are going through as they say goodbye to family and move to a third country. So we've recognized that if in situations where we have a longer period of time to interact with students in the pre-arrival phase, it's really beneficial to try to invest in some of that soft skill development, helping them prepare themselves, develop stress management tools, self-awareness, so that they are well equipped for that culture shock upon arrival. And I think maybe the last thing I'll say, and then turn it back to you, Rebecca. Similar to what Alvaro has said in talking about major orientation, we have realized that the most effective inputs in terms of pre-arrival services are those that will make a big difference in their first academic semester. We know that upon arrival, this whole other plethora of support services exist on campuses in Canada that students can tap into. And we're trying to use our resources, slim though they may be, to try to address the questions that may cause the greatest integration challenges in those first 3 months. So thinking about their major, helping them anticipate the different educational pathways that exist in Canada, helping them anticipate that it may take a while for them to navigate towards their major of choice. They may be dealing with disappointment upon arrival when they can't get into an engineering program, but if we were able to better prepare them to know what the building blocks are towards the academic path they're interested in, then that certainly helps both reduce stress and anxiety and preserve the sort of the integrity of the sponsorship, as Alvaro said. You know, worst case scenario, we don't want to have students in a situation where they feel overwhelmed and may, as a result, consider, you know, discontinuing their academic studies. I'll pause there and back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Christine. So as a follow-up to what both of you have touched on, and there's a great deal of information there, I think it might be interesting for our audience to hear a little bit about how you've figured out what these students need. And Christine, you touched specifically on timing of when, you know, how long you have with a student, when a student's coming in. Maybe you could reflect a bit, if you can, both of you, on how you've kind of figured those things out, you know, what they need in terms of, Alvaro pointed to what it means to enroll in a higher education institution in Mexico. Christine, you talked a lot about the different kinds of skills students need, as well as how to navigate applying to Canadian universities. How did you figure that out? And that also gets to a question that is in the chat too, directed more at Alvaro, which has to do with when this vocational orientation is happening. So maybe in your answer, Alvaro, you can touch on that question too. Is it in the first year or before they arrive?
Sure. Thank you, Rebecca and Jill, for the question. The orientation year is once they arrive to Mexico. It's 1 year before they enter the higher education institution, but they're already in Mexico. And all the Spanish course and the orientation and integration is on that year, but they're already in Mexico. And more related to the other question you made, Rebecca, and I think what Christine mentioned about the timing, it's key. Like the students have different needs and have different thoughts through the time they are in the third country. And in our case, they are thinking something different when they're in integration year that when they are already in the university. When they just arrive, they want, in our case, they want to learn Spanish the next day, and they want to go to the university the next day. So, but it's different because when they are already in the higher education institution, they're not thinking, anymore else about their facing in Aguascalientes or how they suffer in Aguascalientes or the hard time they had while they're learning Spanish or deciding what they study. They're more focused on getting to know their new partner students in the university, to get to know more about their careers, to get to know about how the new place they're going to live. And yes, going back to that point, yes, I think timing it's extremely important because it's long periods of time. No, in our case, a student that is studying an undergrad or a bachelor students, it's in Mexico at least for 5 years. No, 1 year of integration and 4 years of university phase. So it's a long period in which the students will think a lot of things. They will miss their families, they will miss their food, they will miss the connection they could have to their country of origins or the first country of asylum in which they had been a couple of years, of many years. So in our case, I think we have identified like different time periods in which students have some specific thoughts. For example, we always say that when the students arrive and they start their integration phase here in Mexico, they're like in a honeymoon. They're super happy that they got selected, that they got to Mexico, that they're going to learn Spanish, that they're going to university. And after a couple of months while they're in the integration phase, while they're learning Spanish, there's like a downside. And they start feeling a little bit sad about how the Spanish course is so slow, how they think they are not learning the language, they think they were not able, won't be able to get the proper level to then start their university career. And and in the last trimester of the year, like you can actually the change of the students of how they already learn Spanish and how they are already integrated in the community. You know, something that happens a lot here with specifically with Syrian students. As I know, as a small comment, it's that when they arrive, they they don't like dogs. No, this is something small comment that happens. They see dogs in the office and they say like, "Oh no, I'm very scared of the dog. Please take it away." And once they are about to finish the integration phase, the first year, you can see them carrying the dog and being playing with him. You know, so it's a big change. It's something you see the students how they change of personality even, no, because they are growing. They're becoming different human beings and their thoughts are changing through the time, no? So, um, so it's very important to also identify how everyone is growing differently in our case, no? Because every person, every human change and grows differently. So we have identified that there are some key moments, but at the same time, you have to focus on each individual, you know, through the time. So yeah, I don't have a special recipe to identify which are these key moments, but I will say that and pass it up to Christine.
I'm really nodding, Alvaro, because I think a lot of the experience you have in the Habesha project resonates for us. And there's times actually where I've thought about how wonderful it would be to have an integration phase upon arrival in Canada along the lines of the 1 year they have in the Habesha project. You know, we typically bring students 2 weeks before classes start. And so there's this intense ramp up upon arrival. And I agree with you, the honeymoon phase is there. And it's happening alongside their first semester of academic courses in most situations. And then that crash is also very real. I think the ways that we've come to understand what students' needs are, like just thinking of your question, Rebecca, I think there's probably 3 different lenses we use. We hear from students directly. So during their arrival phase, we are checking in with students in small groups, and sometimes individually when there are more integration challenges. So we are trying to follow somewhat of a student-centered approach because of that in the individuality that you referred to, Alvaro. Everybody's experience is very unique and different. So we try to have as many channels as possible for hearing from students how their experience is, so that we can modulate and support future cohorts based on that learning. The other really key way we have come to understand needs is we've always had sort of informal engagement with alumni of the program. So by alumni, we mean students that are done their first year. Our program is a 1-year sponsorship, and after that 1 year, we refer to them as alumni. We have an alumni advisory team that's become a more formal mechanism for us now, and their experiences, we on the alumni team, these are students who we have a blend of people who've been in Canada for 10 to 15 years or 3 to 5 years. Some are still students, and so pulling in their observations and perspectives on the important phases during pre-arrival support, as well as post-arrival support, has been really helpful to, I think when a student has perspective in terms of the duration of time that they've been in Canada, it changes the way they reflect on those moments in their journey that were stressful and why they were stressful. And some of them, as one example, have said, some students do come in and do like a semester of full-time English. And during that phase, most students rail against it and they can't wait to get into academic courses, and they're frustrated and they're impatient. And 5 years later, they may reflect back and say, I am so grateful that I had that time to build up a foundation of language, settle in on a cultural level more deeply before getting into the academic experience. So that distance that SRP alumni have, I think, is really important. I think the third lens that we learn through is hearing back from academic advisors and those that are in the sponsorship group. So in our model, refugee students, when they come to Canada, are supported by a network of fellow students. And so we also have really open channels of communication to hear back the generalities of what they're seeing in the student experience. So I think when we triangulate those different lenses, but always, I think, just to repeat what Alvaro has said, there is no one size fits all in the pre-arrival phase, and we're doing our best to think about the typical areas that students experience challenges, and set up programs and services that are based on those needs. But we also have like the resourcing challenge, right, of being able to do student-centered, personalized, one-on-one support is beyond our capacity. So we have to do group stuff, and sometimes we will be missing needs that are outside of the norm. Back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you to both of you. Building on what you just said about how no one size fits all, maybe we can now turn to Priscilla. And Priscilla, maybe you can comment a little bit on the ways in which you work with local actors to mobilize students through complementary education pathways.
Thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. So for us, the perspective is a bit different because we're not a provider or a program, and we are located in the first country of asylum. So it's we help the students identify program, we share opportunities, and we try to walk through the process with them. I'm based in Chad, and although the main language of our students here is Arabic, the most opportunities that we have are in French. So we have been working now for about 2 years with the Campus France program, which is a platform that allows students around the world to apply to study in France, no matter their status. Mostly it comes without a scholarship, or it could come with a fee removals, but fees are quite affordable in France, so it's not like a full package. What we have found out throughout the time working on this program is that students were lacking a lot of information, and refugees tend to have the idea that a lot of what is happening doesn't apply to them because they're not locals, because they don't hold the citizenship of Chad. So we have partnered with the Campus France program to set up information sessions before the opening of applications. When applications are about to open, we gather potential candidates and we have a session with the administration of the program so that they can answer any question. Prior to that, we had negotiated with Campus France to ensure that they would accept the refugee status in lieu of a national ID on the platform so that refugees would not have issues applying. So it's fairly a new program, and Campus France here is interviewing thousands of candidates per year. So it's, for them, it's not an individual journey. But for us, we have much less students that would be applying, and even less that would be selected, and even less that would get the visa to go study to France. What we have come to notice is that the students, the refugee students candidates, they're a bit lost because they have never left the region. Most of them that would be applying come from Central African Republic, living in Chad now. So for them, it's not only a different world, but a whole process. So we tend to have sessions with them, and Campus France kind of get it real session. Okay, if you are applying now, it's going to imply this and this in the future. Are you sure that you can manage this? We don't want to raise expectations. Once the students are selected, we do all, obviously, the administrative support. But what we have noticed this year when we had 2 students leaving is that Campus France doesn't provide any kind of cultural orientation or any sort of support on how to navigate the French administration or system. So we kind of had to do an office-based quick learning program on what would you expect. Like, you are going to arrive to France, especially in time of COVID. We had like the whole, okay, you're going to need this paper, you're going to need this app on your phone if you want to take a train, and all these things that Campus France does not really prepare you for. So this is what we have done with the students. Like Christine said, for us also, it's a very short timing between the time they have the visa and the time they're leaving. And we don't want to raise expectations. We don't want to do this whole discussion with them before they have the visa, because the visa has a financial component that is quite high. And so this year, out of 4 visa applications, only 2 were positive. So, you know, we don't want them to be super excited and have the pre-departure honeymoon and then not to leave. So it also makes the timing very short to prepare them. So we have set up, it's, for us, it's still the beginning. So we set up this WhatsApp group with them when we're still following them now in France, and they're sharing with us how they're feeling and what difficulties they might have, and we see how we can support them from here. But yeah, I think what they need the most is this, at least here, is this peer support. This thing, okay, let's sit together, let's discuss. Where are you going to live? Okay, let's look on Google. Let's go on this website where you'll find an apartment. We have contacted also universities to see, do you have any kind of association in place for students, for refugee students? Is there a possibility that they access student housing, which is much cheaper? And it takes a lot of time because it's different universities, different profiles, students going to first year or third year, studying history or communication. So it's really fit per person. But I think it really helps. And what we're going to try to set up now is, now that we have 2 students that have departed and are living in France, they now become ambassadors for the others who are interested. So we can have sessions with Doudou Orgon, who can explain, okay, this is the process, this is what I did, this is how I managed this challenge and this challenge, and try gradually to grow this community so that they support each other. Globally, this is the partnership that we have here, because it's the only Chad-based program that would be allowing people to go study abroad. Of course, we also support students who will be applying to corridor programs, which are then much more tailored to refugee students and already have the kind of orientations that you were talking about.
Thank you, Priscilla. So one of the things I hear you getting at, and also Christine kind of referenced this, is a real complexity of trying to balance the need for individual advising and individual tailored support with what's often a quick turnaround and also a volume of students and very different scenarios that they're going to be encountering. As a follow-up to that, I wonder if there are any other challenges that you've encountered in preparing students to go abroad that you might want to speak to how you've mitigated those challenges. And then from there, we'll turn to Alvaro and Christine and see if they also want to comment on this question.
Thank you, Rebecca. For one of the big challenge I think we have seen is that the students tend to not have much clue what they're getting themselves into. It's like I said, it's a whole new world. In Chad, they don't have bank accounts. They don't use a computer for school. They have classrooms with 100 students, and then they'll go to something much more tailored. So trying to find the right advice to give them for us is difficult. It helps that we have French staff in the office that can explain, okay, this is what you're going to need exactly. The fact that Campus France doesn't provide this cultural orientation is quite a big challenge for us, because you have to find a way to discuss to students about anything, about personal relationships, everything that is so different to them in Chad or in their country of origin that they don't have in France, that will be completely different. When the students have arrived in Paris in September, I texted them and I said, what's the first thing that surprised you when you arrived at the airport? And they both answered that nobody cares about you, everyone is such a hurry, they don't say hello, and so these are stuff we don't think about telling them in a cultural orientation. Like, people do their stuff. It's people are busy, people have fast lives. So these kind of things can be a challenge for them on a daily basis. I met one of the students a month ago while I was traveling in France, and I sat with him and tried to have this discussion. Okay, it's been a month that you have arrived. So far, what is the biggest challenge for you? And apart from administrative challenge, the hardest was for them for him at least, to make friends, to feel like a sense of community, because he's the only refugee, he's not a refugee in France, he's a refugee in Chad. So in France, he's an international student, like the status has changed. So he's the only in that kind of status in his university. He doesn't know anyone much around, and is trying gradually to get into the program. So I think gradually will also help once we have one student leaving and have more connection with each universities. It will be much more helpful and have this kind of a peer support for them. But yeah, I think everything is quite challenging, honestly, from the administrative part to how you're going to study in the classroom to how you're going to live on your own. Like the student told me, this is the first time I'm cooking for myself, and I never thought about that. It was like, well, at home, there's always someone to cook for me. It's like, now I have to go to a supermarket and buy things and cook them. And for us, it's, yeah, okay. So yeah, we're trying to do our in-house orientation program, but we're definitely not yet the best at it. But I think it will come with time.
Thank you, Priscilla. So we have 3 minutes left for this panel, and I wanted to just turn to Alvaro and then Christine briefly to comment on any challenges you've encountered in pre-departure, pre-arrival orientations and how you might mitigate them. Alvaro?
Sure, thank you, Regan. Yeah, I think Priscilla mentioned many of the challenges we also have here. I mean, hearing like going to buy your food and cooking it and that kind of challenges is something that happens here. Maybe it's a little bit different in terms of how they integrate here, because usually the students, or what, and additionally, service that we offer while the students are in the integration phase is that we offer a students residency in which the students live together. So they have like this, even the students don't know each other before arriving to Mexico. Once they are in the students residency, it's a small backup from them. No, I mean we have students from different nationalities, from the complementary pathways. For our specifically is from mostly from Middle East students. So they create a community to hold on themselves. No, when the students are here in Aguascalientes in the integration phase, you can see most of the serious students together when they just arrive. No, like to hold on themselves and you can see them cooking together, cooking Arabic food together, speaking Arabic together, and going out to get to know the city together. And at the beginning, that works because it's a big shock to come to Mexico, and also Mexico for them. I think probably from Canada too, but they don't know absolutely anything about Mexico other than what they have seen in movies, which I think it's not the best opinion. I think what they saw in movies is the best perspective of Mexico. And you can imagine what I mean with that. So they come with this strange or new idea of what Mexico is like. So they're here, and being together in this students residency helps them to start to integrate in the country and to be ready. But then again, the challenges mentioned by Priscilla are always there. No, another we have in this students residency we have like a small set of rules that students have to follow. For example, one of them is that they have to clean their own rooms. No, clean their rooms or clean the house. At the beginning, that's also a challenge, no? Because they say, why I'm going to clean my room? Why don't you let me leave my room, which I feel comfortable with my room, no? So you're like, oh, well, you're right, but at the same time, it's part of the set of the rules. Can you please clean your room? No. So I think just to leave it there and give time to Christine in a matter of time, I think that again, the challenges come a lot of how the students live them, and that we from the implementation of these programs, we also have to focus a lot on the challenges every individual could have, because they can be as small as cooking as themselves, or they can be as big as having or in the need of some psychological support.
Thank you, Alvaro. Christine, you can have 1 minute.
All right. Well, I was nodding vigorously to a lot of what Priscilla and Alvaro said, so I won't overlap. I thought of maybe a very practical, tangible challenge to share with the group that relates to the different country of asylum context where students are coming from. So something we've said already, that there's no one size fits all, the importance of being student centered. But I think it is also for us, there's practical logistical realities by country of asylum. And I think I'll use the example of Kenya and Uganda, two countries where we're selecting students. So in Kenya, we're selecting students from two camps, Dadaab, Kakuma. We end up with a sizable cohort in both of those two locations. So the delivery of pre-arrival services has a certain efficiency. The students are clustered, they're in one place. We can network with local actors to ensure they have access to computer labs to do online pre-arrival stuff with us. So that's one modality. And then Uganda, on the other hand, where we're selecting students across 12 settlements and urban locations, we end up with a cohort that is dispersed across the country. And there's a wide variety of digital infrastructure that exists across the different settlements and urban areas. So we end up faced with this reality where we either are delivering fewer pre-arrival services to students in those dispersed areas because we don't have the resources to solve the logistical challenges. We don't have the money to bring them together. We'd love to have like a 3-month in Kampala residential pre-arrival program. We haven't figured out how to resource that yet. And so we feel this tension of having kind of unequal levels of pre-arrival support for students in different countries of asylum because of those realities that exist. So we want to offer more pre-arrival services where we can, but we're also aware of what can be perceived as inequities. Upon arrival, these students are intermixed and they're in the same campuses across Canada. And we have become aware of these, concerns that are reflectable. I hear you guys got 3 months of language training before you came. That's amazing. Didn't happen where we were located before Canada. So we're trying to find a way to have more equitable services, but also resist what would be kind of an approach of kind of working with our lowest common denominator in terms of the digital infrastructure. So I think this is where like collaboration with other actors, I think it came up as a question earlier, is a really key point. We can't deliver these services alone. We really need that collaboration and support from existing programs, and to be able to connect students to ongoing services and programs that will complement what we're able to provide, I think is kind of the sweet spot we're aiming for. I'll pause there because that's probably more than a minute. Sorry if I went over.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to all three of our panelists. Some of the questions in the chat are going to be addressed in the next panel. So we're going to move to the next panel now. I'm actually gonna, I think, hand it back to Neela, and then we'll address some of these questions in the next 45 minutes.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you to all of the panelists for all of your experience and insights. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of the session, I think there are so many follow-up questions once you listen to the experience. So feel free to continue to use the chat. Maybe Christine and Alvaro, there was a question specifically about what happens if students do not reach the required language level. Maybe you guys can respond to that in the chat if you wouldn't mind. And then Mehari, we will talk about sort of psychosocial support services in the next session. So I think this is a great segue. We already talked so much about really integration and inclusion and the challenges around those topics. So I will hand it over to Carrie Bistrom. She is the Associate Dean at Bard College Berlin, and she will guide us through our next conversation. So Carrie, I don't want to take any more time. Over to you and the panelists.
Thank you so much, Nele, and to the panel before. That was hugely interesting, and I think shows how much thought all of you have been putting into designing pre-departure, pre-arrival preparation that will be kind of the most needed in that immediate arrival phase, and what you have been calling as the integration phase. So as Nele mentions, this next panel really picks up on this arrival question. What happens when students are in their university for the first time, in the first semester or the first year? And I'd like to begin, I think, by taking a step back from the notion of the integration phase. On our campus at Bard College Berlin, integration itself has been a contested word. And I know as well on our panel, that's something we've also talked about when we were preparing. And I was hoping we could get sort of two sides of the picture from France, from Chantal, from the University of Paris-Saclay, and from Rudy, who's the co-founder of the Union of Exiled Students in France, to hear from the kind of administrator professor side, and as well from the student side, sort of why integration or inclusion are so important. Maybe we'll hand it to Chantal first.
Hello. Yes, I just wanted to thank you very much for all the information we got from the previous panel. I mean, it's very useful to know how much we miss here and how much progress we can make. Anyway, so last time when we convened, I mean, we talked about inclusion versus or as a complement to integration, because of course integration is probably only related to admin procedures, accommodation, healthcare, follow-up, whereas inclusion means much more the human aspects on campus. And that's what we're not very good at in France very often, because we're not prepared. I mean, we have all the services, but we're not prepared to offer this as a package, probably because this was not planned to be so in the first instance. Hence the term inclusion, covering every other detail that the word integration doesn't cover. So for me, inclusion means trying to coordinate all the services that offer positive integration to students, which means being a massive university. I mean, our size is very big, and we are located on in seven towns south of Paris. Inclusion is a real challenge because it depends on the place where you're studying, plus on the people who you're dealing with. So at a central level, we offer those services, and at a local level, we need to sort of manage to be able to coordinate all these. And this is not always, 100% the case. So we've had this year a real challenge insofar as we've had to integrate and use inclusion as a real, a real challenge for 3 students from Afghanistan, for example. And we've been trying to deal with this since August. And I think that on campus is one of the major issues in France, because on many campuses, French students stay during the week and go home at the weekend. So trying to include international students is an enormous task. You need to be able to relate to associations, student associations, associations which are close to the campus, and associations including citizens in the towns where the campuses are located. And so all this is in a way, it's more than a challenge. It's trying to organize it is not always 100% feasible. So we're trying to get organized this way. And we have many structures, but students in France are not always aware of what international students are facing, or fighting with. And I'm talking about refugees, it's even more, of course.
Thank you, Chantal. I'm going to hand it over to Rudy, who I think can pick up very nicely from that challenge of figuring out, moving from a metropolitan student body need towards this other new student need.
Thanks a lot to having me today. Actually, in my point of view, it's important to focus not only on the effort of integration put on the student, but also on the effort that university must do to be inclusive. When I'm talking about exiled, for me, it's asylum seeker, refugee, and undocumented students, because the Union of Exiled Students is working with all of this. So unexiled or and foreign students are always forced to make all efforts. They have to learn language, new methodologies or exercises, new social norms and codes. They have to find by themselves how to find a room, how to have access to course, documentary, or library. To be honest, almost nothing is done to help them to understand all of this. There is only here in France a week at the beginning of the year called the Integration Week, but it's only made by a professor giving a really in academic way and in academic French language this kind of information and formation. There is no attention being paid to exiled and foreign students, nothing about their specific needs, and no one takes into the account their difficulties and to understand the language and the culture. For me, inclusion means an effort being made by the university to help every student with specific needs on an individual level. It implies creating spaces where you can ask your questions in your mother language, maybe, or in a French sample language, actually. And what is important is just to give time to explain these things, which seems be obviously or evidence for French people. For me, inclusion means programs for monitoring and educational support courses. So this is what I'm thinking about inclusion and integration, actually.
Thank you so much for that reminder that we should not only be focused on what needs to be done by students, but also how the university culture itself needs to shift dramatically. In many cases, it's a really important insight. At this point, I want to turn over to our third panelist, Tiffany, to ask you, in your experience, I know you've been working with students with a background of displacement at a couple of different institutions now. What do you see are the main areas that students with a refugee background typically need support in? Bearing in mind, of course, what Rudy just said about it not only being about students needing support and needing to change and improve, but also the wider university setting itself also doing improvement.
Yeah, very important question. So I know in my bio it says that I'm currently at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, which is where I've just recently shifted to, but the university that I'll be talking about is the Asian University for Women in Chittagong, Bangladesh. So some of you might be familiar with the context, but just to be very brief, it's essentially a small liberal arts college. It has about 900 students, and there are about 20 different countries represented by that small student community. And it's donor driven, so majority of the students are on scholarships for their undergraduate education. So we cater to trying to give higher education opportunities to students from very challenging backgrounds. So often they're the first in their family to attend university. So, and we do have students who either are classified officially as refugees, or are at least from refugee background, can be described in that manner. So I've been in that context for about 6 years, and thinking about that question, I guess two main challenges come up for me in terms of the most pressing demands for that particular community. The first one is emotional, so psychosocial support, and this question of belonging and well-being, I think, combined, both of those two. Because I feel like before they are able to really learn and feel okay about learning and about sitting in these strange classrooms with these strange teachers, they have to have some kind of anchor. And for a lot of them, they've had experiences of being thrown out of the anchoring in their lives. So I feel like that's the first sort of need for the particular population that I was working with. And secondary to that, I would say learning support. So learning support in a broad sense. So that could be to do with language acquisition, which some of you have talked about. It could be to adjusting to new content. So that could be like the manner in which content is delivered. It could be online or face-to-face, but they may not simply be familiar with the way that content is shared and the language it's given. Yeah, and people have mentioned this before, like just not familiar with IT, computers, labs, communicating online and these sorts of, but also learning capacity and learning styles. And I would say we're not a hugely resourced institution. So a lot of the resources that people are mentioning here, where they've got, campus-based counseling services that are well staffed, we don't have that. We don't have, we have a writing center, but we don't have, during the pandemic, we really struggled to keep the writing center actually staffed. So the pandemic had a huge impact on our ability to retain people in Bangladesh, which was quite difficult. So I think there's a lot of good intention and goodwill, and people do what they can when they can, but for our institution, it's been quite difficult to sustain these services. We recognize the need, but it's sort of making sure we have consistent funding, consistent staffing. And because Bangladesh isn't necessarily, people don't often stay there forever. So they'll go to Bangladesh, they'll be there for a year as sort of an experience, and then they'll move on. And so that's also a challenge for us in terms of implementing meaningful, programs and responses. But yeah, to be brief, I would say, yeah, emotional support and learning support. both of those aspects. Yeah.
Thank you for that thoughtful response, and also for setting the context in which you've been working. I wanted to turn it back to Rudy and to Chantal to see, you know, from their perspectives, you know, would they identify those same areas, psychosocial support and learning support, as the two key areas that are needed to attend to, and to think about how well the sort of current options in their university context are at attending to those particular needs. I'm not sure who wants to go first.
Rudy? No? Okay.
Go on,
well,
Chantal.
I mean, I quite agree, but okay, you want to speak first, Rudy? No? Okay.
You can do it. I'm following you.
All right. Okay. So I totally agree with what Rudy said before, that universities should adapt more and offer more services. And it's one of the reasons why I've stepped in as a, you know, I mean, charge of this at the moment. I mean, I've retired, but I'm dealing with this, and I'm trying to improve things. And there's a lot of work, I can tell you. I mean, which is so offering the support we have is one challenge, and trying to offer more is an even bigger challenge. But we're trying to, you know, we're starting from scratch, I should say, and hence the need to refer to other organizations and associations. And Students in Exile in France is a good example of what can be, you know, of the type of support we can have. And I'm afraid, as a university, and even maybe the biggest in France, we're not very good at it at the moment. But I mean, we've got we can improve. You know, I mean, we're trying to. So yes, it is a challenge, and yes, it is something we have identified. And psychological issues, language issues are things that are very important, and we cannot rely on the services that we've had for a long time, because we need additional help to be able to provide additional help to this specific audience. And they need it, and we are the ones who need to work on that, not the reverse. You know, it's not the students shouldn't have to adapt, we should adapt to them, and that's a big issue. I agree with that.
Thanks, Rudy.
Yes, I will talk a little bit about the psychological support, actually, if you allow me, and about our experience as exiled students in the university. In French universities, actually, there is a psychological support, but it's especially after the first wave of the pandemic, there's a problem that with this support, it's already saturated, actually. What we, for exiled students, there is a special need. First, they don't have actually this culture to go or to consult a psychologist. And to be honest, it seems like when you're going to the psychologist, it seems that's a place only for people who had a psychological disease. So then to make an exile to speak selfly about his or his experience, trauma and migration pathway, you need a safe space. A safe space with the stability and this possibility to speak about it in your own language, actually. Here in France, there's some universities or organizations offer a translation, but there is a problem with that also, because the problem is that exiled people are living in the ghettos or in the same communities. When you are coming from Syria, you say you can find a lot of Syrians going or living together. So if there is a translator belong to the same country or to the same culture or the same social class, it's really hard to be oneself and to express oneself freely. So as Union of Exiled Students facing all these problems, we try to offer a psychological support. We create a workshop of drama therapy and theater therapy, and we go on to support groups. So, and it's in Arabic, in Pashto, in French, so they can speak their own language. Why we did it in this way? Because actually when it's drama therapy, when it's theater therapy, they are playing and they don't feel that they are talking about themselves, and it's helped to overcome all this prejudice when you are going to the psychologist. So this is our experience with this, and it's really helped and changed and make them express themselves, talk freely about all these problems that they faced on. And what are the universities here in France doing? It's really good, but as I told you that it's already saturated.
Thank you for helping us see in a little bit more detail what a helpful support mechanism might be, a psychosocial support mechanism beyond kind of just adding university counseling hours, if that's even possible, because it does seem like we need to be more creative and flexible about these kinds of support also. I'm wondering if we can get into a little bit more detail regarding other kinds of support services that are falling into the categories that we've mentioned. For instance, I know something that's come up in a number of discussions in the working group have to do with the kinds of legal support universities can offer. Are there anybody in your universities, Tiffany, Rudy, Chantal, who can offer legal support for students on questions when their studies are interrupted, what happens post-university, family unification issues, and are there other topics that haven't come up yet in addition to psychosocial support, language support, academic writing support, and legal support that you would want to mention? I'm going to hand it over to Tiffany and then to Chantal.
Sure. In the context of AUW, we have a security, like the sort of center person at the moment would be the head of security. So he is a Bangladeshi official from the military. And so he is the one that students will go to because, I mean, it's an international student community, but they are living in Bangladesh. So they have to, the students and faculty have to be mindful, right, of the legalities of that context. So if a problem comes up for a student related to their visa or a financial issue or potentially it could be a domestic violence issue, they tend to go to the security officer first, and he might say, well, you can deal with this with the counselor, or I will actually take this up outside the university space. But I just wanted to mention that something that the Dean of Students, who was going to be coming along to speak to you today from AEW but couldn't, she has been pushing for several years to actually have a social worker hired, a full-time social worker hired as a staff member at the university, because we are in a context where we're dealing with young women from, who have confronted and still confronting issues around domestic violence and child marriage and refugee status with their families and things. So very complex, challenging, and for students from Afghanistan, Syria, all sorts of places. So a very complex web of problems that can interrupt their study. And so we haven't managed to get a social worker hired yet. The pandemic, again, has put a lot of pressure on us in terms of the sort of the bare bones of what is sustained. But I think a social worker who is familiar with that cultural context. Ideally, you would have 5 of them who are familiar with multiple cultural contexts. But yeah, at least having one person would be very helpful. It would take the load off the Dean of Students as well, because she has to it's a minefield of complication, so much diversity. Yeah.
Thank you. Rudy or Chantal?
I can go on the legal support if you want. So if I will be honest, there's nothing to be found on campus here in France about this legal support. There are a lot of social workers, but there's nothing, and they are not trained to work with these specific issues of exiled people and exiled students. In the same university, there is, in some universities, there are an office open one day a week for exiled people and students, but it's managed by French students who are still learning and are not able to answer every question and every need of exiled students. Here in the Union of Exiled Students, sorry, I'm in the I'm in the rush. In the Exiled Union of Exiled Students, we are trying to provide some help with our association to train all these social workers and within universities and to help them and to prepare them to respond and to find solution for all these problems and issues. So in France, I didn't find any legal supports offered by universities. It's only as civil society and association organizations which doing and offer this kind of legal support, and all the time they are saturated too. So I will let Chantal continue, maybe.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, minus something that exists in some universities. At Paris-Saclay University, we have what we call the GATE, which is a free comprehensive range of services all gathered in one place to guide students through admin procedures, including social security, cruise services, and the French sous-prefecture, which helps students get residence permits. But this is for all students, all international students, not only refugee students, right? But it's better than nothing, which means that for our refugee students, we put them in contact with that specific place, and this is open from end of August till the 17th of December. So the refugee students we welcomed this year were able to go through these procedures, which means that it was not specifically targeted at refugee students, but they could benefit from this, and they've obtained their refugee status thanks to that sort of shortcut. But I agree with you that this is not targeting refugee students in particular. It's targeting in all international students. But thanks to this, we could manage to go through a shortcut for them in a way. But I agree with you, there are no legal services for refugee students.
Yeah, it seems like this is a big hole in an area in which universities, if I may, are also a bit like perhaps most uncertain as actors, because of course, in terms of the legal aspects of getting folks into the country through complementary pathways. And I think this maybe speaks to a question that was in the chat from one of our colleagues at BRAC about missing qualifications and all kinds of things. I mean, many universities have pretty clear procedures. And of course, there's been a variety of initiatives on qualifications, the Norwegian Qualifications Initiative, things of this nature. And people are advocating for, more visa, importantly, including this working group, more student visas as complementary pathways. But, even myself, until we really started talking about this in our pre-meeting, to think about, well, what kinds of additional legal support will students need, or could that come up in terms of what happens if their studies get interrupted? What happens, if they're able to reunite with a family member? Like it seems like that's also an area in which we could stand to develop a lot more expertise and alliances, like the law clinic idea that also was put into the chat. That's quite an interesting model. We have less than 10 minutes left in this session, and I had two questions that we wanted to get to. One of them, I think the last in this line of what more could universities do? Of course, there's always more, but I think one thing that did come up in our questions was what kind of support there is for students to prepare for the labor market. I mean, I think right now there's a lot of emphasis on getting students, you know, into the university, getting their languages up to speed, academic writing, etc., to kind of make it through the university. But we can't, you know, we should at the same time keep an eye on what's happening right now and the immediate ground level skills, but also think to what will happen when these students graduate. Right? Are we working with a plan towards graduation in the labor market, you know, from the very beginning? And I'm wondering, Tiffany, for instance, or Rudy, do you have some thoughts you might want to share about that?
Tiffany or me? I can do. I will do it in 2 seconds. It's for me.
I have a brief comment. You go ahead.
Thanks, Tiffany. For me, it's actually there's three things universities should do. It's better access to degrees like alternance, internships, make exile students meeting actors on the labor market, and coaching them like how to do interview jobs, how to write a CV and a cover letter properly, because all these are keys to have access to the labor market for me. And I will let Tiffany continue.
Yeah, just related to that, we have a CDIP at AEW, which is the Career Development and International Program Center. So that is a center that advises students from the beginning of their degree all the way to the end. So the students are actually encouraged, they can take academic credits if they do internships, for example, during their undergraduate. So a lot of students are very passionate about making sure they make connections into industries. It could be into corporate work or NGOs during their, you know, by their second or third year of their degree. And because they get academic credit for it, they're very motivated to make those connections, and they're very proactive with internships. So I see that aspect of when they graduate. I feel like there are a cohort that do have made those connections, but I do think, as with any student community, I think there are students that don't necessarily take up those opportunities or hear the news about what they need to do to get access to these opportunities. And I think we could be doing, and also the internships on offer may not actually be appropriate to some of the students that we have in terms of the kind of work that they ultimately want to do. They don't necessarily want to work in a corporation, for example, eventually. So they don't really see it as a relevant opportunity. So I think we could do more to, again, going back to what they were talking about in the first panel of like looking at the individual, right? It's a constant challenge between looking at the individual and what would be best for them, and then also needing to maintain sort of processes for the whole community. So that is a challenge. The other thing I just wanted to mention on this is that I always found it frustrating in that context was that we placed a lot of emphasis on creating leaders and bringing in young women and building up these sort of leadership skills, whatever that might mean, right, in that particular context. And so there was a lot of sort of deconstruction of the world when they first came into the degree. So critiquing the world and analyzing it and pulling it apart and asking lots of questions. But then, okay, we get to the end of the third year and they're about to graduate. And I've had a lot of third year students come to me and say, I don't know, like, what is this? What do I do with this degree, right? It might not be an AEW alone problem, but this is a common question that I had when I was there. And we used to run some workshops, sort of reacclimatizing workshops, how to navigate back from higher education back into your cultural context and have that process make sense in some way. Because for a lot of them, it was very jarring. They were coming from a village in Afghanistan down to Bangladesh, taught in this kind of liberal arts model, you know, and then that door closed and they went back to their family in Afghanistan. And so for them, there's a constant disjuncture in their head of, so that's nice that you told me all these things, but what do I do with that information, right, in my life, in my actual life? So I think that's for the job market and also just as a life question as well. I think it's yeah, sorry, I could talk about that for a long time.
Yeah, I feel like I would also like to continue hearing about this and other people's comments, but I just have one I just have a final question for our panel because we have only a few more minutes left, and it circles back to a point that was made, I think, earlier in the prior panel, and also to a comment in the chat right now about having monitors or people from the school kind of involved in welcoming and working with newcomer students. And that is, you know, we know that one of the key, or it seems like one of the key determinants of how happy and thriving a displaced student would be in their new home community, their new university community, would be a connection with the rest of the student body and with local initiatives. This is very challenging though, and I do know that we have a lot of experience in how to make those connections successful. So for the last question, I just was hoping to get a brief response from Tiffany about her experience in this, and then to give Rudy and Chantal a last word on sort of any topics that they'd like, and then we'll close off the panel.
Sorry, Kerry, could you briefly just repeat that question? Just in a
Yes.
I was
How
looking.
can you say
Sorry.
do you have any like tips or best practices or approaches to engaging the wider student body at universities in supporting student inclusion?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I would say a very, very major factor at AEW is the student clubs. So we have a very thriving student club community, which the students, very student-led. Again, they take a lot of initiatives with this, and they use the student clubs really as vehicles for inclusion. And so we encourage students to, when they arrive and they don't know anyone, we say, look, go to the student club fair and you can meet a lot of students, you can see what the activities are. And we have mental health club, photography club, filmmaking, theatre, drama, speak up club, a whole lot of empowerment club, social justice club. There's just so many, and they really are involved. So I think that the student clubs are important. Also, the orientation sessions for each program that we have throughout the year. So just connecting students, having breaking the ice sessions with students. We have candle circles. I'll just mention that last one, candle circles we had when sometimes we've had like a horrific sort of event happen to a community of students back in their home country. And we struggled at times to know how to communicate, say if there'd been some violence in one country and some of the students had lost family members. And so this was a challenge for us as to how do we want to acknowledge what's happened, but we want the other students to acknowledge it, but we don't want to sort of bring unnecessary attention if the students don't want that sort of thing. So we started having candle circles in the lane just to commemorate, sort of acknowledge these moments. And that was all about inclusion as well. So it was trying to create solidarity and recognition for particular groups and bring in other people's attention and awareness, you know, because they may not necessarily know what's happening in these home countries. So yeah, these are just examples of what we're doing.
Thank you, Tiffany. And perhaps 30 seconds from Chantal and Rudy. Do you have any best practices or suggestions on this topic?
I'm not sure we're very good at it for the moment, I'm afraid. We're trying. But I must admit that we're building up, okay? And but I'm not sure we've been 100% successful in that respect. Rudy?
For me, I think it's there's two things that we notice as a Union of Exiled Students. It's just maybe if we offered the courses not for exiled students, it will help them to study a lot and to understand. The second one is during the exams, maybe if they have this third time, it will help them to really advance and to be as doing a great job actually, and to help them to advance in them exams and studies. This is what the two things I will maybe propose.
Thank you so much for those suggestions. Okay, I thank the panelists and hand it back over to Nele.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Thank you very much, everyone. It's hard to make a conclusion to this session because I feel there's so much to talk about. There's so many more questions. And I apologize that we can't really comment on all of the comments and questions in the chat. I will just maybe add, there are initiatives around the world, of course, WUS, but also in Germany, the Integra, and then Mihari is mentioning Unicore, where you do include students to facilitate inclusion of students with refugee background on campus. I think sort of like a last comment, a bit of self-promotion, I'm putting the link to our website in the chat and really encourage everyone who's here today to join the community of practice, which is a platform that will allow the Global Task Force and all of the stakeholders here to continue these types of conversations. We also want to make sure that we help people make kind of, connections so they can follow up bilaterally. We do see that there's already a lot of conversation happening between different stakeholders just on this webinar. So please go to that website. It's a very brief sign up form, but then in 2022, we will develop a work plan. We will follow up with more specific sessions on topics that might be more relevant to individual universities and other stakeholders, to students. So again, stay connected, sign up, and then we would love to be in touch in 2022. Again, thank you everyone for so much food for thought. I certainly will have a lot to think about once I log off, not only for today, but really for a long time. And I appreciate the perspectives and the wealth of information from everyone who participated in the panel today. As I mentioned, this is not the last virtual session. We will have our final virtual session of this series on January 18th. You should have all received an updated link to that session that will focus on developing sustainable programs. And just sort of one comment on that is it's touching both on the financial component, but also sort of how do you design a program that can be sustainable? I think much like today, right, we're talking about integration, inclusion, both academically, but also on the more cultural and social level. One does not work without the other. So for the sustainable programs, we will discuss how can you really design programs that once they're implemented are successful and have also continued funding behind them. So I hope that everyone will join us on January 18th for that session. Same time, same place as always. With that, I would like to conclude today's session. Again, thank you very much for joining us. I really hope that everyone has a peaceful and joyful holiday season and a great end of the year and can take some rest towards the end of the year. And we look forward to reconnecting in 2022. Thank you very much and bye-bye.